Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with our Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on June the 14th. So, crop progress, service calls, and a special guest is the way we've been running these this year, and we're going to continue in that same pattern this year. But I do want to offer something new for our listeners. If you happen to have any questions or particular topics of interest, feel free to go ahead and drop those in an email to me at charles.scoville@syngenta.com. And we'd love to just address some of those in future weeks if we get a chance. So, crop progress this week, spent a lot of time on the road. Also, was looking at our GHX app, and that corn that we planted on the 1st of May would have accumulated right now 606 heat units. That would put it at that key V5 growth stage. And of course, we're putting rows around on a lot of corn out there in the field right now, and most of the corn's in really good shape. So I feel great about the potential of putting just the maximum number of rows around those corn ears out there. But soil moisture is actually lower than expected right now at about 15% versus a normal 32%. And, I know some folks are still damp in places, but we could use a rain here in central Michigan. And we've got some hot, dry days coming at us next week now. The reality is, it's probably not so bad because these plants are just pushing down roots. They're looking for moisture, and that's going to set them up for probably some greater success come this fall. Speaking of fall, the GHX app is putting us at a September 22nd black layer date, 32% moisture. So we'll get this heat, and that'll probably move that along even faster. Soybean wise, been digging and finding lots of nodularizations on those roots. So you cut those little nodules open, they're pink inside, they're producing nitrogen, they're creating great color. A lot of them, if you think about the V stages, seeing a lot of V1, V2, and further along, even yet trifoliates out there fully open. In general, though, I will say the corn crop probably looks better than the soybean crop. A lot tougher soybeans out there, especially those planted that late April, early May time period this year. Service call wise, got a few interesting calls this year. Actually, true army worms reported over in the Ravenna area. Had a friend that cut some hay. Underneath that was just the ground was crawling with army worms. And certainly interesting. What do we do from here? So, the threshold for army worms, you need 50% of the plants showing fresh cutting and larvae that are 1.25 inches or smaller in order to justify a spray out there. A lot of those larvae are pretty big right now, but please keep an eye on those wheat fields and oat fields and even cornfields out there, because if they're still feeding, they're going to march across the roads. They're going to continue to feed, and we certainly want to spray if we're hitting that threshold. A non-insect, actually slugs, which are mollusks and not affected by insecticides out there, still got another report this week in central Michigan, a complete soybean field devastated and needed to be replanted from slugs. Now, truly the best solution there is tillage. We've got to destroy their homes. We got to dry out that top inch of soil. But folks, when we're replanting that, we got to make sure also we're getting that seed into where the moisture is. And with this warm weather, we should get some really fast growth and probably outgrow most of that damage out there. Finally, here, tar spot. Can you believe it? It actually has been found in northwest Indiana, not too far from the state of Michigan, already confirmed. Also in Iowa and some other places, so way too close for us. But you think of the spring we've had, it's been just consistently damp, and that is ideal for getting the brewing of tar spot going. So what do we do today? Just simply be aware that we're probably going to have to do a fair amount of scouting for tar spot this year. And so be thinking about that, putting that into our plans as the season progresses. The other thing out there on the road, seeing a lot of, I guess what I will just call sprayer blight. Just some tough fields where you can see the leftovers of some damage from sprays, and just asking folks to be careful out there, just not to damage this crop any more than we're going to have out there just naturally. But thinking of that whole idea of crop protection, I have asked Justine Terwilliger, our Syngenta Agronomic Service Rep, to join us here this week to talk a little bit about that herbicide and crop protection world. Welcome, Justine.
Hi, Charles. How are you?
Hey, I am great. Loving chance to be out there and seeing these crops growing and developing, and really appreciate you joining us here today. As we jump right into the three questions I want to cover, the first is, it is starting to get that time of the year when crop development is causing some of these corn herbicide cutoffs. I guess what do my listeners need to be thinking about for controlling some of these late season weeds?
Yeah, Charles, that's a good question and something that's been coming in a lot. As you mentioned, it's funny with our soil moisture, it is below average right now. But if we go back and thinking when we were planting corn, it was super high. We just couldn't catch a break to get into the field, to get planted, to get applications out, battling against wind as well. And what this led to this season on those corn acres is we missed out on a lot of pre-emergence herbicides that window. So what this led to is having to push back those applications to more of an early post program or even making some adjustments to our weed management program. So something to keep in mind, and you kind of hit on it, we are seeing there's some crop response out there just because of the conditions I think we've had to spray in, but also we need to be aware of what our key height or growth stage cutoffs are for these herbicides in a post-emergent setting. And really that's going to start, V2 is probably the earliest one. Fortunately, most of our herbicides are not cut off at that point. I would say our most common one is going to be 11 to 12 inches, which we are, I would say, getting past that, not on all acres, just because we do have a variation in growth stage out there depending on when stuff was planted. V6 would be another common timing. And then V8 is really going to be, I would say, that last major growth stage cutoff or 30-inch tall corn. So those are things to keep in mind, and why it's important that we don't go past these application cutoffs is we do have the potential to really bang up our corn, especially past that V6 timing, because that growing point is going to be above ground at that point. Now, what I would recommend is if we are in that post-application timing, which for most of our corn acres we are, I would make sure, one, paying attention to that application cutoff, but then also tank mixing in, if it's not already in a premixed product, a non-selective foliar herbicide such as glyphosate, and that cutoff for that product is going to be 30-inch tall or V8 corn, which gives us a little bit more leeway, or glufosinate is another good option, and that's going to be a V6 cutoff. Now, with these two herbicides, something to remember is your corn has to be tolerant to these herbicides, so this would not work in a conventional program. And really the value in that and adding in those non-selective foliar herbicides is it's going to offer a little bit more robustness and burn down of our annual grasses and other broadleaves that might already be out there and offer another effective herbicide mode of action to your program. And from a resistance management standpoint, which is, I would say, on the top of everyone's mind every season, this is a really good practice.
Justin, I couldn't agree more on this multiple modes of action thing out here. We're fighting a tough fight, and that's about the only way we're going to stay ahead of that. And every time I listen to you here, I think about, of course, the label is the law, right? And
Yep.
so, thinking of that and all of these things you are recommending, certainly always checking our labels on that as well. The next thing is, walking fields this week, I am seeing more and more perennial weeds out there. Any thoughts on controlling these tough weeds?
Yeah, so that is a hot topic. So often when we think about weed control, we're thinking about now and getting effective control right now. But something that we need to think about and shift our mindset on with these perennial weeds, such as things like Canada thistle, pokeweed, hemp dogbane, milkweed, I would say those are the most common ones I've encountered over the last month, is actually the most effective time to control these weeds is early fall. So when we think about our perennial weeds, these are weeds that are going to come back every year. So they have a root system that's constantly there. So when we're thinking about how these weeds grow, when they're in the stage right now that we're at, they're rapidly growing and they're putting all their energy into new leaves and producing flowers. So what that means is if we go out there with an application of glyphosate or glufosinate, those herbicides are not going to be translocated down to that root, which is how we're going to get an effective kill. They're going to be translocated up, which is not going to give us a super effective kill. It might just burn off the tops, which means they're going to keep coming back year after year. So with that in mind, obviously it's not great news to hear. There are things that we can do. If it's really an eyesore out there, you can burn off the top. Another option is with most of these weeds, you can also get effective control like during flower bud initiation or kind of right after, because at that point, the growth or above top growth have kind of, settled out, and that herbicide will start to translocate down to the roots, but that doesn't always align with where we're at in terms of cutoff. So something that might need to happen is when we're looking at trying to control most of our other annual broadleaves and annual grasses is get out earlier with your prime herbicide program. And then we might have to come back closer to that like 30-inch time frame, just because it's more than likely when that perennial weed is going to be at that flower bud standpoint. Now, when we think about that fall application timing, what I would say is glyphosate. I know there's mixed reviews on this because I have growers that have gone out right now with glyphosate and they're like, it didn't work. Well, in the fall, most often glyphosate is going to be our best option because it moves very good systemically. And again, that plant will be translocating all those sugars down to that root to give it a good kill. Another thing to keep in mind is that with this is on top of being out there at the correct time, we need to make sure that we're utilizing proper application techniques. So having a higher GPA, make sure you're choosing the right nozzle, spraying at the right speed, spraying in the right conditions, so making sure it's not too windy. And this is all going to help us get that effective control.
Yeah, absolutely. GPA gallons per acre, they're getting enough water to move that product around there. And yeah, I think about, anything that's getting ready to go into winter, it's trying to survive. So it's trying to stuff back down into those
Yep.
roots. So what a great thing to put down that roots is some glyphosate and knock those things out with that fall application. Great advice there. Finally, let's talk water hemp. It is getting worse in Michigan every year, it seems. How should we be managing it in corn and soybeans?
Yeah, so that is a good question, Charles. Water hemp is definitely, I think, top of mind with most of our growers. It's one of the toughest weeds that we battle with, not just in corn and soybeans, but across a lot of our other specialty crops. The dry beans deals with it, sugar beets deals with it. Basically, any crop we're growing in Michigan is struggling to combat against this weed. And one reason why it spreads so rapidly is it has a very high seed production, which if you've gone out and seen a water hemp plant at the end of the season, there can sometimes be, hundreds of thousands of seeds on one plant. So it really doesn't take much to have a major issue within a couple of years. But there are things that we can do to manage it. And I would say one of the key management practices is going to be having a grower implement an overlapping residual program on their farm. And what this means, I know it's kind of a funny term, like, what does it even mean? And that's going to be starting out with a pre-emergence residual herbicide. So such as a herbicide mode of action group 15 product. So this might be like an aspettolochlor based product. And then what we're going to do in an ideal world is come back within 21 to 28 days later with another application of that residual product. And the main goal in doing this is that we're going to keep that soil concentration of that herbicide at an adequate level through canopy closure to hopefully minimize any weed escapes of small seeded broadleaves, such as water hemp. Palmer is another one I've gotten questions on recently that falls into that same Amaranthus family. And then things such as annual grasses, which I would say have also become more of an issue recently. Another key benefit of having that planned overlapping residual is it does reduce selection pressure for herbicide resistant weed populations. And that's because when we think about our soil applied herbicides, they're really great. That is the best time to target those weeds is when they're seed versus when they're up and out of the ground. But if we're not replenishing that soil to an adequate level, especially for things that have a wide emergence window, such as water hemp, we are potentially exposing to reduced rates in the soil. So one way to combat that, again, is this overlapping residual idea where hopefully it can keep us clean through that season and we would have minimal weed escape.
Very good, Justine. No, I appreciate that. The more we can stay ahead of that weed, the better for all of us. So Again, Justine, thank you so much for being with us today. And folks, appreciate you listening as well. So everybody have a great weekend ahead. This is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday.